have about 15 minutes, so I'm going to touch on 3 or 4 things very briefly, 2-3 minutes each. And I'm more than happy then to take questions and really make sure that what I say is of interest to somebody rather than just what I think is of interest. The 5 topics I'd like to touch on. First, my path in life. I got some of the potential questions. Different people asked me about that. I must say what was very unique about me was that somewhere in my childhood, as an only child, as a descendant of a family that was long involved in public service, particularly in the Dravidian movement, I just assumed that I knew what my destination would be, that I would end up in public service like my father and his father before him. So what I did, unlike most people, I tried to take the most circuitous, interesting, winding road to a predetermined or predestined destination. In many ways, that was the making of my life. My degrees were in different disciplines. I got experience in different fields. And somewhere along the way, I realized at the age of 32 or 33 that one part of the world I didn't understand at all was economics and finance. I'd never taken a course. And as a consultant, I used to make all kinds of recommendations, and things that made obvious sense would never get done. And somebody say, no, but finance didn't approve it, something to that effect. Now, if you're old landholding family like mine, finance is seen as kind of usurious and associations with things like money lending. So we really didn't encourage that kind of career. But anyway, I decided, as I've done much of my life, is to learn something from scratch. So at the age of 33, I went back to business school, got an MBA in finance, got out at 35 with no real intention of going to work. And then was drawn to Lehman Brothers, took my first paycheck as an adult, other than my student scholarship at the age of 35 at Lehman Brothers. Spent 15 years or so in the world of finance, and then took voluntary retirement and came to public life. In finance, I would say I had the great luxury of going to Sloan, because I think we had some wonderful professors. I was at the age where I could really ask the right questions and absorb the answers in a way that benefited me tremendously. Sort of people like Stu Myers, who wrote the seminal books on corporate finance, to people like Franco Modigliani, Rudy Dornbush, people who were really profound thinkers on public finance, on and even technical things like derivatives with Ross. I learned so much in that year and a half, and it fit my view of the world and much of the math I'd learned as an operations research major. And it really transformed my understanding. For example, till I took this course on public pensions and policy with Franco Modigliani, it was not apparent to me that it was the job of the state in a civilized country, in a democracy. It is the responsibility of the state to make sure that those who cannot survive without the state support are provided the support, whether that's social security, whether that's disability, whether that's pensions, all of that stuff. It should be the responsibility of a caring government in a democracy to do that. I came from a relatively privileged background. We certainly didn't have schemes like that in India when I was growing up. So that was a transformation for me. I would say in finance, in my understanding of it, and I participated in some of it, the quantification of finance, which started with very sophisticated bond trading, and as you may know, it's much more complex than equity trading or valuation, which is a bit like shooting in the dark. But bond trading is very mathematical and very technically driven. And from there to derivatives and finally to securitization. I think the world of finance was transformed dramatically once we had these kinds of quantitative modeling and quantitative finance. In fact, at Sloan, they started offering 2 finance degrees. One was called financial management, one was called financial engineering. There was actually that much math and technology in finance. Equities, on the other hand, is a bit like an IT business. right? When you're in bond trading, you're in the math business. When you're in equity trading, you're effectively in the technology business. The speed of execution, access to pools, placement of algorithms like VWAP and so forth profoundly can change your profitability and the nature of the business. I would say what I learned on Wall Street was that if a trade existed, especially if you could find both sides of the trade, you traded first and then you decided which model fit the trade. Because once you were out of risk on both sides, it didn't really matter whether the model was an accurate model or not. In the course of my few years in the derivative business, the volume of credit derivatives outstanding went up from few tens of billions to few tens of trillions. And in that period, the basic underpinnings of trading credit derivatives, from the standardized swap agreement terms to the expiry of contracts, whether they were customized to the date of trade, like bonds, or whether they were synchronized to the quarter expiry, like options, to our understanding of risk and return in the tranches of securitized products. If credit improves, do all tranches get valued higher? Or does it mean that there's a zero-sum game because the product's already securitized? These kinds of things changed dramatically as the market kept growing. And yet nobody said, oh, we traded a few hundred billion on that model. What happens now to those products? So at some level, in every aspect of the market, whether it was derivatives, securitized products, I would say the tail started wagging the dog. Right? The extent of derivatives outstanding started affecting the bond prices, and the extent of risk in the banking system started affecting regulatory behavior. So much so that if there's interest and people ask me, I'd say that in some ways we may have seen the death of monetary policy since the GFC. The banks no longer basically, the reserve banks, no longer basically control inflation or outcomes. They've become followers and politicized. Public life, 2 or 3 minutes. I came relatively innocent. I've tried to stay as innocent as I can. It's very hard to be in public life. I would say that a lack of administrative capacity, a lack of systems, and especially in the case of government, a lack of institutional memory are the things that greatly limit better outcomes than we see now. I would say our constitution, like most constitutions, is actually very exquisitely designed. And were it to be executed in the way it was designed, I think we would have far greater outcomes. But the reality is today, many of the norms in the Constitution are effectively not followed or non-functional. I would say in my life, one of the most intense experiences I've had is actually participating in an election. You get about 30 days. At the beginning of 30 days, you wonder how you're going to get everything you need to get done, because legally you're not allowed to do certain things till you're registered as a candidate, and then there's only this limited window of time, 30 days. I would say unless you've lived one of those, it's very hard to explain. All of a sudden, you become, if you're successful, you become like a meta-level operator. You're able to get done in 24 hours what normally takes you 72. And that's the only way you can actually conclude an election if you are able to meet your ambition. In my case, because I choose to not vote, the extent of preparation and the extent of execution is probably quite intense in different dimensions, because I don't have this kind of a practice. But in general, I would say that it is also a time of great learning and improvement of public understanding for politicians. There are some similarities, I would say, between the financing of the world and the financing of governments or the public exchequer. I would say success is driven by almost exactly the same factors. Do you have good information? Is it timely? Do you have good systems and institutional memory? And most importantly, have you designed the system with the right alignment of incentives of the people? If you design it the wrong way, you get the GFC in the markets. You design it the wrong way, you get what we see now in a lot of governments, deficit spending without substantial distribution of that wealth to the bottom of the pyramid. But those on top of the pyramid keep grabbing more and more of the resources, and the government is never quite efficient in distribution. Incidentally, I would say it is a core responsibility of government, even in a capitalist system. In fact, particularly in a capitalist system. If democracy and capitalism have to go hand in hand smoothly, then government should be in the redistribution business to ensure that society stays cohesive and that enough of the progress of the wealth is distributed to the bottom of the pyramid that they stay vested in the system as it is and they don't become revolutionaries. I would say the common failure of both markets and governments is that too much wealth is aggregated in too few hands. If you take the public markets, the reason that central banks are stuck, if they raise rates too fast, everybody accuses them of tanking the economy. Central bankers have become like politicians, they can't afford the risk. If they don't raise rates at all, what you see is asset prices around the world spiking, but not really improvement in the condition of the working class or the average wage. Short-termism. Every politician has to worry about the next election first. Every corporate CEO, including bank CEOs and asset management CEOs, worry about the quarterly results being posted and what that does to the share price. And I would say that is probably one of the biggest drivers of this lack of true progress and aggregation of wealth. There are some differences. I would say that, relatively speaking, corporates, banking, the global financial markets are transparent and better regulated. What you see on the books is what you really expect to get, relatively speaking. Whereas in most governments, from the reported data to the unsaid things, there's a huge amount of opacity. There's also a huge amount of subterfuge. Almost nobody says what they mean, or almost nobody means what they say. At least in the corporate world and in global markets, that's not true. People are driven by different priorities. I would say in the capital markets and in banking, the trick is that, in the process of efficiently allocating capital, and I could argue, if I went all the way back to the roots of finance, that really all of finance is based on what they call the life cycle theory of investing, which is that all young people are net needers of financial resources or support, and all old people are users of built-up assets, and therefore all finance is really about moving money forward and backward in a lifetime. It's about bringing it forward when you're young, it's about saving it and pushing it outward when you're middle-aged and working, and about utilizing that when you're old. If that's the basis, then there are only two variables that should drive the world of finance. One is fear and one is greed. That is risk and return. In fact, the more technical finance gets, the more those things get hidden. And we get a lot of mumbo jumbo that obfuscates the fact that really all of finance is only about fear and greed. In the course of, in the case of public finance, I would say the true mark of a good government should be relatively equitable outcomes. That is, those at the bottom should get a lot of support and those at the top should be paid for it. Should be paying for it, for redistribution. But across all countries, all parties, all governments, I would say that is the single failing around the world, is that we find more and more of the wealth is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And this is not a healthy outcome for democracy or doesn't bode well for the cohesiveness of a society. I would also say that two big differences. The priorities change a lot between private enterprise, the world of finance, and government. And also the speed changes a lot. In most private enterprise, things get done when they get recognized. Everybody agrees something needs to be done, it gets done. In fact, in most governments, status quo is the most likely outcome. Very few people have the courage or the desire or the skills, and the skills comes last. Very few people have the desire, the courage, or the skills to actually drive change. And of course, we know that without driving change, we cannot get different outcomes. So either you're happy with what you have now, in which case, what do you care about change? Or you want to get better outcomes, you have to change something. But very, very few people have these assets that are required to drive change. So I would say at an individual level, that is probably the single biggest weakness of finance and public finance all over the world.